You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof, the smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 289 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I got a guest on, Kevin Doremus, to talk about the realist school of foreign policy. As most of you know, I'm sure all of you do, as listeners of the show, I definitely have the non-interventionist school, but there are different thoughts on foreign policy, and I think as far as it goes, the realist school are probably the most natural allies and the ones that we could talk to and find a lot of agreement with. So, Kevin, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
Doing good, thank you.
So, I met Kevin through the Facebook group Foreign Policy Focus. He's a frequent poster in there. We've had a lot of conversations. He is a graduate of International Affairs of Middle Tennessee State. He's somebody I would consider kind of just an observer of U.S. foreign policy, specifically Asia and Eastern Europe, that kind of region of the world there. So most of the important stuff going on today, he always has insightful things to say in the group, and we've had a lot of good conversations there. So I thought I'd bring him on the show, to talk about kind of the realist school of foreign policy. And so I'm just going to kind of start off by kicking it over to him, allowing him to take some time to explain the realist school of, foreign policy and, where there are differences with, the non-interventionists. I'll go ahead and, I think he's going to kind of highlight that stuff here.
Well, I guess to start off with just a basic overview of realism, it takes its inspiration from people like Thomas Hobbes, Machiavelli, and Theodosius. And I think the really good basic sense of it is that realism is the acceptance of, the most disagreeable aspects of life. So violence, sin, suffering, all that exists in the world. And also realism focuses on more of the actual nature of human beings rather than the ideal nature, which like the rival school of liberal internationalism kind of wants to make everyone the ideal version of humanity. And central to this theory is the struggle for power, states competing with one another in this anarchic world for survival. And they focus on more like power, national security, and survival. And that's the primary dominant drivers for their national interests. But within the realist school, there's many different variants. So the non-interventionist would be one. Got the Cato Institute where I interned at one point. They have this whole non-interventionist section. But also in the realist school, there's offensive realists, so more hegemonic stability. There's the offshore balancers. There's the restrainers. But also there's kind of the realist constructivists, which I would also fall into as well. And I guess to go to your non-intervention point where there's some separation, I think the biggest difference in realism would be the hegemonic stability and the non-interventionists, because hegemonic stability, they believe in more offensive realism. They believe in this still unipolar world taken from Francis Fukuyama, the end of history, and they want to preserve this international order that the U.S. has had today. However, as the rise of China and Russia beginning its interference, whether in Ukraine or in Syria, that threatens that stability. So they need to have more U.S. military strengths. And the restraint-oriented realism, they kind of argue for a pullback of all U.S. military operations, whether it's in Europe, Middle East, or Asia, and focus more on the regional aspects at home, whether instability in Latin America. So things like that.
The interesting thing to me is always kind of like the offshore balancing, because they really do mean offshore, right? They're not talking about controlling like Syria and Iraq from Saudi Arabia. They mean like attempting to put some influence in the Middle East from somewhere like Diego Garcia, right?
No, they offshore balancers, they would rather have all our operations more based in America, but then they would work with allies in that region this is your problem, not our problem. It's more let Saudi Arabia handle the situation, let Iran handle the situation. Or as Barry Posman writes in the restraint, in Asia, you would let Japan, South Korea let them handle the rise of China, or the Philippines handle the rise of China. So why should we go and commit our resources to dealing with China when they're in that neighborhood? They understand the region, they understand the historical context, where Americans over here, whether in Tennessee or LA, well, what do we really know about that region, and how are we really experts to solve, all these complex issues?
I think when people think of the realist school, two of the big names that come to mind now are Walt and Mearsheimer. Of course, they're the authors of the great book, Are the Israeli Lobby in U.S. Foreign Policy, even though Israeli policy is U.S. policy at times. But, these two guys have new books out each, and you were lucky enough to hear each of them speak recently. So I was wondering if you could kind of tell us about not only their new books, but their theories and, maybe what you think some of their strongest arguments are.
Well, both of them kind of argue for more of a restraint bent on U.S. foreign policy because overall they were offshore balancers. But in these books, they specifically talk about restraint. Mearsheimer, I think, takes a little bit different tack than Walt, because Walt discusses, all the failures of liberal policies, whether in the Middle East and in Asia, leading to the rise of China and Russia. But Mearsheimer, he discusses more in a broad theoretical sense, discussing things like nationalism, how particularly Western ideas, we assume that everyone is going to be like us, where in fact different societies have different cultural contexts. So universalism is fine, but then when we try to impose it on other people, that's when things get muddy. So I think those are the main differences that I got from that. The audience questions to them were rather interesting. People really, well, this was in DC after all, so they really were kind of believers in like this unipolar world of everyone should be like the United States, everyone should adopt U.S. cultural norms, so on and so forth. So, and I felt like they kind of responded to those questions pretty well, to arguing like who are you to decide, the cultural standards are for Afghanistan or for Guatemala. Let them organically develop their societies instead of from a top-down approach try to social engineer them. So that's kind of what they were talking about.
Yeah, I probably should ask you this before I ask the Walt Mearsheimer question, but where or is there like a universal morality that plays a part? I know with like the non-interventionists, part of it is a lot of its originated in the libertarian non-aggression principle. That is simply immoral to use force against other people. I don't know if this is necessarily like a tenet of the realist policy, so I was just kind of wondering where that kind of comes into play.
Realists don't take morality into account. The weak acquiesce to the strong, and the strong do what they can. So it is what it is, and that's kind of really the blunt version of it. So morality, realists don't really take into consideration morality. I think that's a problem, because then you questions of imperialism, whether in a multipolar world where you have like the three polar powers imposing their will on the periphery. I think that could bring up some moral questions, but they don't take that into consideration.
Right. And I guess, and to clarify there too, it's not that they don't care or they want to see people in other places die. It's more of just from a practical standpoint of trying to, I guess, create the best environment for the U.S. and the world. You simply can't take into account the morality of every person.
Well, yeah, you can't take into, because there's bringing in the constructivism, right? Everything is kind of subjective in some sense. Like a person in Afghanistan might not have the same moral code as the U.S., or someone from Slovakia might have not the same moral code too. So in a multipolar context, the universal standards kind of become more muddy. But.
Right. Well, there's a couple other people I want to ask you about. Two of them, I've learned a lot from and followed a lot, that definitely come to the top of my list when I think of realists. Trevor Thaw and Emma Ashford, who have done excellent work, especially on the Middle East conflicts. I remember, I think it was drone war stuff that I read on Emma Ashford when I first discovered her. That was like tons of new information and just great detailed research. And had I just read the one article, I would have, just assumed she thought all the same things that I did about U.S. foreign policy.
Yeah. I got to listen to her lectures when I was interned there, and her main focus is on the petrol states, just researching Russia, Saudi Arabia, United Emirates, and discussing how we've kind of become the client states of the Gulf states. And that's kind of the basic premise for her. I think she does like the Power Problems podcast, kind of focuses more on the restraint bent of U.S. foreign policy. She isn't a libertarian. She's kind of a fan of like the George Bush senior's foreign policy, whether it's working with Gorbachev to kind of make that deal to not expand NATO, which then Bill Clinton kind of threw away. And then Trevor Thrall, I got his recent book, U.S. Grand Strategy in the 21st Century. I think it's a book that must read for libertarians out there, because it talks about how from the progressive era, the U.S. national identity became this messianic being, like from, I think it's Theodore Roosevelt, if I have the chapter correct, where he talks about progressive imperialism. That's what like liberal hegemony was originally called. And then over time, this Wilsonianism took over, and liberal internationalism, neoliberalism kind of took on that brand of U.S. spreading its light across the world of darkness. And Thrall was kind of demonstrating all these different unintended consequences of our actions and creating instability, whether it's in Latin America, the Middle East, or even in Asia, creating these national interest conflicts with China and Russia.
All right. Well, are there any other realists that you would suggest either libertarians maybe go out and follow on Twitter, or just keep an eye out for their bylines? People that you think or have influenced you?
Oh, for sure. That would be Edwin Van De Haar. He's the author of Classical Liberalism and International Relations Theory, and there's an article on the Independent Institute's website. It's free for everyone to download. It's the Hayekian spontaneous order and balance of power theory. Because what I found, and what even he kind of writes about, the economists, more libertarian bent, they focus so much on the economy and on its norms. They value international institutions, which kind of leads them in foreign policy to go more liberal internationalist. However, Van De Haar, he kind of argues that spontaneous order is very similar to balance of power theory, because it's spontaneous, the international system's anarchic, states face a knowledge problem, particularly like in a multipolar context, that results in the security dilemma, where if one state increases its capabilities for security reasons, another state might misinterpret it. And so it discusses, how balancing happens within the international system. So he's one that I would definitely recommend. Another author would be Christopher Coyne from George Mason University. He has a book called Doing Bad by Doing Good. It's kind of similar to Stephen Walt's book, The Hell of Good Intentions. But he's more on the economist end, describing how because of our good intentions, there's negative consequences on U.S. economy. So those like Van De Haar and Christopher Coyne are ones that are must reads for libertarians. And then I guess my main focus is on Russia. Andrei Sinenkov, he's the author of Russian Foreign Policy, Change of National Identity, and also I think he did a book, Alexander to Putin, as well, in the honor of Russian foreign policy. And he kind of describes how historical experiences shape the way that other nation states see each other. So Russia being invaded from the west, south, and east, it needs a centralized power to maintain control of its region, but also it's paranoid. So when NATO expands towards its border, it becomes naturally paranoid. Oh, here comes another Western power entering its sphere of influence. So he's also another author that's a must read for libertarians as well, just to understand, the dynamics of the international system.
All right. So what I thought we'd do next, and I think it'll be kind of fun for listeners and a good way to kind of get how the realist foreign policy ends up in practical action. And that is to kind of look at some situations around the world and kind of, tell me like if you're president or if Stephen Walt is elected president, Trump resigns tomorrow and somehow through line of secession that ends up being the president. What you would do or what actions or what you think the right decisions would be. And so, maybe a fun one to start with, since I know you're a big Russia guy, is, what position does the U.S. take, in regards to the Crimean Peninsula? Not necessarily, I'm guessing you don't want to send any battleships into the Sea of Azov, but does the United States continue to demand that Crimea is returned to Russia? Do we go to war over this?
No, we don't go to war over this. This is a big problem of that region is like territory changes hands so many times. Like there's a meme in the Slavic Facebook group of this Hungarian being born in Austria. Then his town is Slovak. Then it's Ukrainian, but he never left his town at all. He never left his house. So it's a sad part of that region of the world where it's just a tragedy. It's just the borderline, the borders just change over time. And if there was stability within that region, maybe things would be more stable. It's kind of, you do feel bad for these people because, war is never a good thing. But I don't think it's the U.S. It's what interest does the United States have in the Sea of Azov? There's not really. Crimea, I mean, while it's a nice historical site for the Russian Orthodox Church, does it really have any meaning to the U.S.? I don't think so. So, it's let Russia and Ukraine kind of sort that issue out. That's what I would do.
All right. So next, I thought maybe NATO expansion would be a good topic here. So I guess kind of the coming topic is whether we allow, or I guess extend invitations to Georgia and Ukraine to join NATO. And then also, I mean, generally what you've thought of NATO expansion into the former Warsaw Pact states and even some of the former Soviet republics.
So there would be no NATO expansion, but then there would be an interesting dynamic that's happening in the Visegrad Group countries. So Poland, Hungary, Czech and Slovak republics. They're in this weird, interesting dynamic of their geopolitical orientation drifting away from the West. It may not seem that way, like with Poland, for example, because of Fort Trump, supposedly. But the younger population, when they got polled by the National Endowment for Democracy and GlobeSec Institute, only 27% of 18 to 24-year-old Poles identified as politically orienting to the West. More and more people in the region are now going to the middle instead of the West now. So we need a balance between the West and the East. So the question is going to be, how does NATO as an organization deal with this issue? Because now you have these 4 NATO countries who are now kind of drifting away, not following these norms. I think some people assume that the EU would try to clamp down on them, but that hasn't happened yet. It's just been a bunch of they've just been lectured. So I think that's what's going to be interesting to watch is what happens with these 4 countries. Because then if they decide to break away, then what is NATO going to do? Because all these people, they've been with the training. Are they going to go to Russia, or are they going to form their own little military group? So there's a lot of open questions in the air.
Right. And, it looks like this region even has some more turbulence going on now. I saw that Kosovo was looking at changing I don't know if it's nominal only, but their interior security force into an army. And Serbia is making some big protests about this. And so, it's a volatile region. And these are countries that we're talking about having into NATO. So it seems like this whole NATO expansion thing is just absolutely crazy.
Yeah, it was crazy, and I think it resembles Stanislav Krishibam. He's the author of Slovakia, a history, a struggles for survival. He talks a lot about Western ignorance and how the Western society, from Germany to the United States, they don't really understand the region that well, and because the region is a whole lot, the people there are a lot more pragmatic, and when you don't understand who you're dealing with, then you could make a mistake that could result in big instabilities, as what we're seeing now. But for me, it was a mistake to expand, but now that we expanded, we're kind of made our bed, now we have to lay in it. So we'll see what happens next. dealing with the Balkans, that's a whole nother mess because everyone hates each other, and particularly from the historical memories of the war and all the mass killings that went on. So for that should be, from a realist perspective, that's don't even step your foot in that area, because stability is the most important thing, and entering an unstable environment should be completely avoided at all costs.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think a couple of the interesting things are is if you ask like kind of the random person, if either of us walked outside and just asked people, people see Europe like as being stable, even since the fall of the Soviet Union, definitely, but since the end of World War II, I think they kind of view as like borders having not changed and things there being relatively settled. And so this probably adds to the comfort of people with, being so willing to get involved here. And, maybe one of these days we'll have to do another show going into more detail about all the kind of little regional instabilities here. I did want to turn to the Middle East a little bit and then look at kind of, so Donald Trump is, I think facing more and more questions of what he's going to do moving forward in Afghanistan. We had a good number of U.S. troops, be killed and wounded there recently. And so it's getting to the point where he's, I think, going to have some more and more pressure to make a decision whether to either escalate at least a little bit or leave. And, what would you recommend? And, what do you think should happen?
Well, he should. Well, I mean, we have no business being there. What national interest do we have in that region? I think some people bring up oil, but as Emma Ashford has pointed out, including Christopher Preble, we produce more oil than ever before. So the oil's not the reason. So why are we there? Why are we trying to impose our cultural values on them, right? We get lectured by people, oh, we need to care about diversity. We need to care about, spreading our values around the world. Well, and also tolerance. Well, how tolerant is it when you're going into another country telling them, well, this is how you have to live your life now? So in my opinion, yeah, I'm happy with Donald Trump's decision to pull out of the region and let them organically solve their issues, because there's a lot of issues within that region that they need to solve out themselves, from cultural to religion.
Yeah, well, speaking of, Donald Trump pulling out of the region, just the day we're recording this, not the day the show will run, Trump tweets that we're leaving Syria. And, from my perspective, round of applause for Donald Trump. And we all need to tell him, good job, get the troops home by Christmas. You got, a week to do it in a military with a $750 billion budget. So I think it could get done. So I guess, what's your position here? Should the U.S. just withdraw from Syria, or is that too rash?
No, we should withdraw from Syria. I think doing it slowly would allow, other states to try to entangle us into more conflicts. Like, Barry Postman's Restraint book, he argues for more of a slow, gradual, decrease in U.S. military presence. And William Ruger from the Charles Koch Institute, he disagreed, said, no, we should not be doing that. We should go like shock therapy in a sense, pull out as fast as possible. We do not need our allies entangling us in other endeavors. So Israel might try something to pull us into a conflict. Saudi Arabia might as well, even though that relationship's tenuous at the moment. But the concern is still there that other allies would try to do something to bring us back into the war.
Right. The only person I've ever heard make a somewhat convincing argument to me that the withdrawal has to be slow is Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, who's definitely, on our side of withdrawing from these wars. But he kind of explained that logistically you have a bunch of Humvees, you have a bunch of fuel and weapons laying around, and you have this, this massive bureaucracy, and you don't want to leave any of this stuff behind. So it might take a couple months. I guess that way, so you don't leave a whole bunch of gassed up Humvees with, automatic rifles in the back for whatever random, Syrian militia to stumble across and then use to do God knows, kill who knows what with.
Definitely.
All right. So I guess, before we close out here, I did want to ask if there's any, I guess, U.S. military actions specifically since 2001 that you would say, as a realist, like it's a good thing the U.S. did this. And I know that, you probably wouldn't say I wouldn't do it exactly that way, but in general terms.
I can't think of any that has been positive.
All right.
I feel like since 1989, everyone writes about this end of history. I feel like the United States was given this beautiful basket, and instead of embracing it and having this unipolar world that can last for a long time, the United States has turned this unipolar world into an unstable mess, which then gave incentive for China and Russia to essentially build up their militaries to shore up stability within the region. So no, there's nothing I can think of that is, well, we did a good job.
Right. Well, I couldn't agree more with that. And, looking at that, I guess, too, like, what the U.S. had in 1989, there with the fall of the Soviet Union in the unipolar moment, how could you have possibly squandered it more? If you're looking at it, you really wanted to destroy the U.S. unipolar moment, and you prescribed pretty much exactly what the U.S. has since done. I don't know if you could have hurt, our world influence more in that amount of time. I'm sure there's a couple ways, but it's been pretty bleak.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it has to do with, since the progressive era and how it's created this national identity that the United States need to be this messianic state, with its mission to spread democracy around the world. And this is kind of what me and Adam Graham were talking about is, in my opinion, Democrats and left-wing people can't be restrainers in any way because of the foundation of their ideology has this universal value with liberal democracy and progressivism that built into it, in my opinion, there's this imperialistic bent to it. I know some people will disagree with that, but this top-down approach is very susceptible to these types of imperialistic endeavors the United States has done around the world. So for me, I think, as John Mearsheimer in his book kind of wrote, the only type of liberalism that could bring restraint to the U.S. foreign policy is a classical liberal or a libertarian position. The social liberal or progressive type leaning liberalism would only pour gasoline on the fire, and who knows what else the U.S. could do. So maybe hope and dream that classical liberal ideas or libertarian ideas can somehow spread. So maybe the U.S. will become more constrained. However, I don't see that happening. I think we're going down a, social democratic route, which after they sort out the welfare state issue, they'll go right back to intervening around the world.
Yeah, well, I think have a little bit of optimism that I think like somebody like Tulsi Gabbard is a little bit ideologically stuck on these issues and does seem to have seen the Obama follies in places like Libya, which, I was just reading an article today from the Daily Beast on the slave trade there. Unbelievable what's happening in that country. Again, if you wanted to destroy human rights as much as possible and make Libya as a disgusting a place as possible, you could not have done a better job than backing the Libyan National Liberation Front, which was just a bunch of Al-Qaeda guys, with an air war that led to the brutal slaughter of Gaddafi on the side of the road and absolute chaos and slavery just running rampant through it. They were saying it's like normal practice that people just kidnap you, torture you, and you call home or whatever, and you say pay them thousands of dollars or else they're gonna keep torturing me. And this is just how Libyans are making a living right now. It's absolutely insane. And this was like, I think from, the liberal interventionists, the deep thinkers on the, or I guess deep thinkers, generous, yeah. But like a Samantha Power, who would consider herself an intellectual and has written books on the issue, kind of creates this Libyan intervention and then ends up, it being the biggest humanitarian disaster you can imagine, other than Yemen, I suppose.
Well, but not only a humanitarian intervention, a humanitarian disaster. Look what else did it cause? Because Libya was kind of like the wall that prevented mass migration. So then once Libya and the whole Middle East goes to hell, you have this mass influx of, economic migrants and refugees into Europe, which then destabilizes that region, leading to the rise of, populist movements. So, yeah, not only these liberal interventionists, not only did they get humanitarianism wrong, they know how to even destabilize, Western society.
Yeah, the craziest thing is this was 100% predictable. Even, Gaddafi during his rule was demanding like basically ransom payments from Europe, like a few $1 billion a year, or else he said he would allow the migrants to, cross the Mediterranean. I think the term he used was black in Europe. And so he was really playing up on the nationalistic fears there, I guess. But, it's 100% predictable. And, I'm sure every single one of the realists was out there leading up to this thing saying that, nope, this isn't going to create a paradise in Libya. And yet the, humanitarian interventionists, the liberal right to protect people went ahead and did it and just destroyed that country.
Which makes it even more sick. In like 2013, there's this book that got published. It's called Weapons of Mass Migration by Kelly Greenhill, published by Cornell. And she was talking about how mass migrations, they're all result of all these different interventions that the West has done. And all of them, everyone talks about tolerance and whatever. With the Balkan Wars, there was an influx of the Slavic, whether Muslim Slavs or, Catholic or Orthodox Slavs into Germany. And the same thing happened to what's happening today was this rise of these so-called neo-Nazi parties. It's like, this just happened like in the late 90s and 2000s. And then just take it just a few more years later, and then you have a mass influx again of people entering the country, and surprise, you have again a rise in this nationalistic sentiment. So it's like everyone has been warning about it. There's been historical precedent showing this is what might happen, but people again don't listen. So that's the worst part, is people don't look at history as a lesson.
All right, Kevin. Well, thank you so much for this. I think it was a great talk, a good introduction to the realist thought, so closely, and most of the time in, what I'm advocating for on this show anyways. So, we non-interventionists should be, sure to read, the realist thinkers. Hopefully you'll be writing some stuff soon and I'll have you back on the show to talk about that. For now, everybody can find Kevin in the Foreign Policy Focus private Facebook group if you want to enter there. Is there anywhere else that you have to send people?
No, that's it right there.
All right. Well, like I said, I'll hopefully have some of your work soon. I'll definitely be talking about it on the show and have you back on in the future. For those of you who want to find this show, check out the Libertarian Institute, where you can find all my work, libertarianinstitute.org, and my website, immersionnews.com. Thanks, everyone.